For those who have careers that keep them out at sea for long periods of time, what is the creepiest thing you've seen out in the water? Not so much creepy as eerie, but being out in the blue at night in a lightning storm in a slack wind. The ocean was very flat, no big rolling swells, just tiny little ripples. The whole world would be black, and then there would be a flurry of bolts, and the whole world would be silver. The ocean looked like nothing so much as aluminium foil that had been scrunched up and flattened out. The water looked like mercury, and all the little ripples made these very dramatic black shadows. This sort of qualifies. Former Navy here. Somewhere off the coast of Italy saw a very, very small boat, not much bigger than a rowboat, about 9 or 10 miles offshore. This was sometime around midnight. There was no light from land, and no other ships around. It had a light. Our ship captain said it was a fisherman, and the fish would be attracted to the light at that time. Imagine being in a rowboat about 10 miles offshore in the middle of a pitch-black night, waiting to see what finds you. Empty boat far out at sea. One time on an airport trip, my Uber driver was saying that he used to do security on tankers. That they would run across empty vessels more than you could possibly imagine, just floating, contents undisturbed, wallets, photos, everything. They would hail them with no response, and, not knowing if it was a trap to get close enough to take over the ship, pirates and ransoming the ship is apparently also more common than you'd think. Not the people though. Just the cargo. Anyway, the security team would have to board the ghost ship and scope out the situation. Even yachts. When there was no one aboard, they would sink them to avoid floating strike risks. I was like, surely there is some kind of finder's fee, and he was like, who are you going to call? Made me really wish a John Krakauer or Sebastian Younger would sink his teeth into that story. It would be a hell of a book. Edit, it seemed like there was no central body to call to salvage it. You're in international waters, so there's no coast guard. He implied that anyone who lost track of a ship like that likely lacked the resources/desire to retrieve it. I imagine the ship recorded in their log when they came across other vessels, but whether that information goes up to some authority I'd. Being myself in supply chain management, I know that oceanic shipping can be seriously sketchy, so although I can't corroborate the story, and part of why I posted was to see if it scared up any similar stories, it was related to me as fact, and didn't strike me as a tall tale. Used to be an oil field diver in the Gulf of Mexico. I'd say about 80% of the dives I logged were at night. Mostly 500 feet and under DSVs. It's very eerie feeling sitting on the downline doing in-water decompression in the middle of night. I'd always ask topside to turn off my headlight. Like a worm on a hook. Just bobbing in the darkness. Not even nearly as extreme as your story, but it evoked a memory. I did a scuba diving open water course and then did the advanced course, which included a night dive in a freshwater lake. I was only 5 meters underwater, pitch black darkness with 2 other guys. We were on a platform and we could either face the dam wall or the open water, and I turned to the open water while the other guys were behind me. I turned off my light. We did have little lights on our backs. Just the deepest, calmest dark I've ever felt and seen. Not a single source of light anywhere, just immense darkness. Still remember that feeling, and it was like 15 years ago. Some 20 years ago. On the MV Explorer, since sunk, down near the Antarctic Circle, sailing around the bergs and occasionally making landfall. We rounded into a small bay area, and there, amongst the ice and coast, was an unmarked sailing yacht. Which is odd, as generally yachts have some identifying markings on them. To add to it, they didn't respond to any radio contact, and whilst I wasn't privy to the conversation, and it was a long time ago, some crew went across via Zodiac and were refused boarding. So basically a yacht, not a particularly large one, that was unmarked, was hanging around in the inhospitable waters of the Antarctic, and didn't want any help or contact. Proper weird. I am a recreational sailor who travels for weeks at a time at sea. I once saw a flame on the water not 10 yards from me. Just freaking burning at midnight. Ocean fires are a rare phenomenon that occur when flammable gases seep out of the seafloor and ignite upon contact with oxygen in the water. These fires are not a new discovery, as they have been documented for centuries. Surely weird as F though. I was on a 32-feet speedboat and got caught by nightfall in between islands. No night lights on the boat, navigating using GPS and depth finder. Captain knew the way like the back of his hand since he'd sailed those waters since he was a kid, but for me it was my first time in the middle of the ocean at night. Pitch black but for the stars. As above so below, it seemed as if the boat was floating in the blackest void of the universe. Years later I saw the movie Life of Pi and the scene where Pi is in his lifeboat floating in the dark among the stars, no above no below. It was exactly like that. I still have dreams about that night. The engulfing dark and the silence that was not silent. Surreal. We made it safely to port. Captain fitted the night lights on that boat the day after. I worked on the sailboat one summer in the Bahamas, and something that you see a lot when you're in the ocean is kayaks and life jackets floating around, and you always radio them in, but they always just fell off a yacht or something and it's never a big deal. Once we found a kayak floating and it had a fishing rod in the rod holder, which basically meant someone was using it. Edit, didn't see how viral this went overnight. Some people were asking questions. The Coast Guard doesn't really even look into this stuff unless there is a confounding report, so we never received an update. Not that I would have expected one unless there was a full-scale search. We went up close to it and it had the removable seat cushion still in, which further convinced us that someone had been using it. There was nothing else to see. The line was in the water, but we never really revisited it. We tried not talk about it because the kids on the boat got creeped out after the adults kinda freaked out, and didn't control their emotions. I was about 2 kilometers offshore Western Australia kayak fishing in the middle of nowhere. Knocked a rod overboard and didn't hesitate to take off my life jacket to dive in and get it. I chased it down a good distance before giving up. When I got back to the surface, the kayak was now a good 15 to 20 meters away, thanks to way more wind present than I'd realized. I barely managed to swim back to it, giving everything I had as it continued to get blown away. Was very nearly the end for me that day over a stupid fishing rod and a rash decision. Edit, never anticipated such a response. For my encore. Same WA road trip, somewhere south of Karratha. Was the day after Australia Day, and I was carrying a mighty hangover, 46C, 115F. There's not much of anything in between towns out that way. A detour had been set up to direct cars off the main road to avoid a bushfire. I turned off as per that sign, but didn't come across any other directions. The dirt track I was now on headed in the direction of the smoke. I kept going, expecting a turn in another direction any moment. As I drove over another crest, I could see not just smoke but the actual flames of the fire front now. Obviously this wasn't the intended detour. So I hastily turned my van around. Blissfully unaware as to how soft and sandy the edge of the dirt road was. Bogged to the axles, uncomfortably close to the bushfire. About an hour of trying unsuccessfully to dig the van out, I started the hike out to anywhere I might find help. And I'd seen nothing but desert for at least 20 kms. I cleverly made a trolley out of my 2 paddle halves and kayak wheels so I could take 20 liters of water with me, but in my panic stupidly forgot that I had an APIB satellite beacon for exactly this kind of scenario. Eventually rescued by a fire crew putting up road closed signs a couple hours later. Somewhere in the Atlantic, nice cold as F night, decided to step out and look at stars. About 10 minutes on, and a boat's mast pops up, sits there a few minutes and then back under. No alarms, nothing. Just some sub boys getting a bit of late night O2 in the middle of nowhere next to some friends. I think people underappreciated how chilling it must be to have a sub under/near you. I've been in a boat in areas they're known to be present, generally speaking, and just looking into the water thinking of it under there freaks me the F out. Not sure why, just some folks doing their job. Those vessels are terrifying though. In 20 years the weirdest shit I've seen is other people that work out here. There's about 40% of the sailors like what they do and are good at it. Another 40% that are good at it, but would do something better if the money was right. But there's another 20%. If they lived ashore for more than 6 months a year they'd end up dead or incarcerated. There's no more west for them to go to, so they went offshore and became our problem. I have a friend who works on ships. He said the single scariest thing he had ever seen was looking out a window and seeing a wave that he said looked like it was 100 meters high, pass right by their boat, and suddenly disappear. He knew about rogue waves, but he said seeing one that big, and that close, and watching it suddenly just vanish, was so creepy and shocking that he was literally stunned for a minute. Contract mariner. I disappear into the blue area for 6 to 8 months a year. Creepy? Not much honestly. The sound of moaning steel due to slack tanks when you're rolling really hard can be a bit unnerving. St. Elmo's fire is pretty neat. Fata Morgana aka the Flying Dutchman is pretty cool to see in real life. After a while the only thing out there that really spooks you, is a problem you have that directly influences your survival. All the spooky shit I've ever been a part of, have been no bullshit emergencies. Fire in the engine control room? I'm the first responder down there to see if it's an actual emergency or a F-up consilium sensor. Wall of toxic smoke from burning electronics and the high voltage room? OF. Have an emergency weather sortie because we are dragging anchor and rolling 30 degrees with 50 feet UKC and we're getting pushed toward the island? F me 10 shots ain't enough, we are about to run aground in a 55,000 ton 800 feet ship. Pucker factor. Oops, now we get the hookup to get the F out of there, we immediately lose steering and propulsion? Good shit. I've seen brand new $1 million sport fishers capsized and bobbing around like a cork 1,000 miles from land. I've seen tiny little songbirds skipping along the surface just barely clinging to life, but they're flying as hard as they can to find land. Some of the saddest shit I've ever seen are those little birds skipping off the water as they fly further out to sea hoping to or if they come across some land. I don't know. I'm on the Yingling at a port bar and I'm rambling. To answer your question TLDR style. The creepiest thing about being out there are the bottomless depths of sadness, loneliness and heartache. You will go places in your mind that words will never be able to do any justice in trying to describe. Creepiest thing I've seen has definitely been seeing myself and other crewmates lose our minds. On one particularly awful voyage, everything that could go wrong went wrong and we found ourselves without food, water, and sleep for a very unhealthy amount of time. It started off with auditory hallucinations. Ships are noisy, and when you're going crazy, you begin to think those noises are talking to you. I heard children laughing, a choir singing, and creepiest of all, a particular splash sounded like it was calling my name from the sea. Combine that with visual hallucinations and then things get really terrifying. I was convinced we were in the desert at one point with sand all around us and mountains in the distance. Another crew member freaked out and told us we were about to run into an apartment building. The creepiest thing I saw was an all-black flying pig with red eyes on the bow. I think the scariest though was when someone was convinced we lost part of our crew overboard. It turned into a massive, delirious argument over where everyone was even though we were all accounted for. That trip was brutal, and the captain put us all in a terrible situation due to sheer incompetence. Other than that, there was this one time I saw 3 gigantic ships in the distance with no lights and they did not show up on AIS. Suddenly they were gone. It was extremely creepy. Oh hey, one I can actually answer. So this isn't the creepiest story, I'll admit that straight off. I was working on a tiny oil rig off the Gulf Coast. It was about 2 p.m. I was on what was called sliver duty. Basically you wait in between 2 relatively close together walls on the exterior of the rig, strapped into a safety harness, while someone skirts through a long flow cable that you direct. Boring, but you get a nice view of the ocean for an hour or 2. Suddenly my buddy on the other end of the sliver starts screaming to look down. I do and saw the biggest sea creature I've ever seen in my life. End to end it must have been the size of most rural hospitals I've seen. Just pushing below the surface of the water, it raised its head out and I realized I was really dumb and was staring at an undersea cable placer. I was drinking in an airport bar and met a woman who worked as a commercial fisherman, on her way to SE Asia for R&R with her family. Real salt of the earth lady. She regaled me with stories about her work, all the good stuff about working in her world, all the reasons she kept doing it for decades. I asked her what the scariest thing she saw out on the open ocean was and, without any hesitation, she said, "Oh, an underwater UFO. I saw one rise up out of the ocean next to my boat and fly off into the sky." The matter-of-factness of her answer bothers me to this day. Right. Long-time lurker, first-time poster here. I'm no longer at sea but used to, as a younger chap with romantic ideas, spend months on end on cargo ships. Mostly tankers, crude oil VLCC and refined product tankers, but with a little time in oil and gas and towing. I came ashore in 2017 with a Master Unlimited ticket, sailing as chief officer. My last ship was a self-discharging bulk carrier. Anyway, I digress. It wasn't so much about what I saw which was creepy. I saw plenty of interesting things I wouldn't have seen anywhere else. However, I was second mate on a tanker distributing refined oil products around the coast of New Zealand. Our yacht had sailed from a port on the east coast, bound for another port just down the coast a bit, but it had disappeared. Solo sailor on board, aside from his dog. Nonetheless, the search proved fruitless and it was suspended. However, for weeks afterwards at about 0130 in the morning, the Rescue Coordination Center would broadcast a plea at the end of the weather and navigation warning broadcast asking for the yacht to make contact if it could hear the message and was able to do so. I'd sit in the dark, chain smoking and working on my 7th cup of coffee, looking out into the black, imagining the guy who's had a stroke or heart attack on board with the same broadcast playing out on his radio while his dog ate his face to keep from starving. Or imagining him having fallen over the side, imagining what it'd be like watching your yacht sailing indifferently off into the distance with your dog in the cockpit pacing and agitated, unable to do anything about it. Knowing you were F and had a matter of hours, if that, left to live before the cold got you or exhaustion. Or, imagining the dog starving and dying on a yacht by itself weeks later, listening to the same broadcast in the dark. The places your mind goes in the dark by yourself. They found the yacht in the end. The dog was still alive. Not exactly in the water, but body parts in a sea chest. The sea chest is a hole in the hull which is used for water intake. Pirate booty? Just the feet. I was underway from the port of Houston to Cartagena, Colombia. The vessel cuts all lights off on the outside of the boat, so it's pretty dark outside. I would always go and sit out on the deck and listen to my headphones, and look at the stars. Well, one night, somewhere in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, I noticed a swarm of lightning bugs cross the boat. Totally blew my mind to see light out or nowhere. At least I think it was lightning bugs. On the same trip heading back to Houston from Colombia, I witnessed a satellite crashing. At least, that's what I think it was. It steadily strobed and lit up the night sky and water for about 15 minutes till I couldn't see it anymore. And on a different trip, I was in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. No moon, no clouds, no light pollution. The amount of stars that I saw made me cry. Never thought starlight alone could cast a shadow. Definitely mesmerizing. I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was in the USN back in the late 80s, early 90s. Cruising through the Indian Ocean in 100% blackness, then waking up the next afternoon and looking over the rails and seeing hundreds of sharks swimming alongside of us constantly. Every now and then we would get a man overboard alert. They never recovered even one of them at night. They were usually sewage. I was in the US Navy for about 10 years, and have tens of thousands of miles at sea in an aircraft carrier. Countless nights on the flight deck in the middle of the night and middle of the ocean. Creepiest, a huge patch of the ocean glowing. Like nuclear waste in The Simpsons glowing. I've seen bioluminescent algae of a few kinds and this was nothing like it. I've never seen anything like it before or since. Weirdest thing, hundreds of miles out to sea from land and there was a massive fire on the water. It was like the top of a gas refinery, but on the water, with nothing under it but water. Flame going a few stories into the air. Saddest, a fellow sailor trying to jump overboard. He apparently got a "Dear John" email, and pictures from his cheating wife and decided to end it. We were on the smoke deck, he bummed a cigarette, then asked the time, we said 2300 hours. He replied, "Sounds like a good time to die," and in one motion tried to launch over the chest-high wall, with an opening to the water below. Luckily we were faster than him. We grabbed his legs and wrestled him down and laid on him and basically hog-tied him till the MAs, Navy cops, got there. Broke my heart because he was a good dude. I never saw him again. He got transferred off the ship shortly after. Not sure what happened to him, but I hope he's doing better. Funniest, two flying fish collide mid-air. I was smoking when we were in the Persian Gulf and saw the fish fly from a pretty far distance towards each other. I remember thinking, there's no effing way they're going to hit them, splat splash. I was in tears laughing but no one saw it. Everyone just thought I was a weirdo, but I got to see a miracle of nature, lol. Sometimes, during night time I have went out of the accommodation, leaving compartment on board merchant ships, to breathe some fresh air, or to take out the trash since the garbage station was outside. And when it is completely dark, and the water is calm, you hear the splashing water against the ship's hull. Well, I can't explain why, but the ocean water was luring me, but at the same time you are terrified, since nobody will find you if you fall overboard. So sometimes I was just staring at the water in the dark, and inside me was some struggle, like some part of me wanted to jump in, while the other was terrified that it would be a one-way ticket. Can't still find the explanation for this. This hypnotic, mesmerizing feeling I get, and at the same time the chills running down my spine, that if I would fall in the water, it's game over for sure. I was in a glass-bottom boat in the 1970s off the coast of Oahu. We were going out to see a pod of whales. The boat captain was a grizzled old Hawaiian sun-baked to the color of mahogany. It was an older boat, retrofit with a glass bottom and bench seating. He was narrating over a PA as we left the dock. We motored out for about 30 minutes and the view out of the bottom of the boat was disappointing, just long streams of bubbles obscuring the view. Finally he stopped the boat, and the view was simply amazing. The captain pointed out a pod of whales about 1/4 of a mile away. They were cavorting about, diving and jumping. The captain was explaining their behaviors, but keeping his distance. It was pretty cool. All the whales suddenly dived and disappeared, emerging moments later, right next to our boat. They were swimming all around us, diving and jumping and splashing us with water. Children were laughing, everyone thought it was part of the show. They were right there, almost so close that you could touch them. The captain told us how lucky we were, to see them up close. Suddenly, the mood changed when they started bumping up against the hull of the small boat. People were sliding all over the place, some fell onto the floor, children were crying. Most telling, the captain had stopped narrating and had a look of abject terror on his face. I remember thinking what it must take to make this guy scared, and as he looked terrified, we should probably be too. Suddenly, as quickly as they appeared, the whales disappeared. They were just gone. People picked themselves up and sat back down, mothers consoled children. We started back to the dock. The captain got back on the PA and tried to downplay the seriousness of what just happened, but there was a definite quiver in his voice as we headed back to shore. Not so much what I saw but what I experienced. I was once underway in the Gulf of Alaska during a November gale. Waves were up to 35 feet with some rollers hitting 45. An uncommon occurrence on the diesel-electric ship I was on was a cycloconverter tripping. When this happened, the ship would temporarily completely lose power and propulsion until some electricians could reset everything. This happened during that gale. I simply can't explain how strange it is for the boat you're on to all of a sudden go so quiet that you can clearly hear waves slapping the ship and metal bending and flexing. Knowing you're completely at the mercy of the sea. Knowing that if the ship lost its bearing and went beam to, there was a real possibility of capsizing. It's easy to forget when you're at sea that the only thing keeping you alive is a bunch of steel welded together. At that moment I was fully aware, and it humbled me. Thankfully we trained frequently for this and had everything fired back up relatively quickly. Another time I recall was when the ship took a rogue wave. They are absolutely real, and I believe they account for a massive number of shipwrecks. It was late at night and I was on the bridge. We were passing through a storm and we're taking the waves off the bow with no visibility. As the ship moves, there's normally a pretty standard pattern. You ride up a wave for a bit and then you fall down the wave for a bit. Well, we started riding up a wave and got to the point where we should have been starting our ride down, but we just kept climbing and climbing. And then it happened. We started our ride down the back of this massive wave. All of us braced ourselves and tried to find something to hold on to, but we all fell to the deck anyway. Anything that wasn't secured for sea fell down all around us. Manuals, tables, computers, printers, you name it. Our captain, who was sleeping, called up to the bridge asking if we hit something. It woke the entire crew up. Rogue waves are real, and they're terrifying. I can't imagine being in a smaller boat or taking one of them broadside. A few things come to mind, but I have to say, deadheads. In my younger days, I was captain of a dragger out of Kodiak. She was a 130 giddings marine trawler. I will never forget my first week in the wheelhouse with the owner, who was retiring and showing me the operation before I took over. After a night busting ice off the rails in freezing rain and 2-meter seas, he went to bunk and left me to wheel watch. It was clearing up with a medium haze and flat calm waters. Most of the crew was sleeping or hanging out in the galley, so I was alone and the only eyes forward. I'm drinking some nasty Folgers and sucking down a Marlboro Red, when I see what looked like an old pier piling, straight ahead. I kept looking at that spot, and, nope, nothing there. A few seconds later I swear I saw that thing again, but only closer. Nope, gone again. I thought, shit, I've been up way too long and I'm effing hallucinating. Then out of nowhere this tree trunk shoots directly up into the sky. This thing had to be 60 feet tall and was about 30 feet off the bow, dead center. I damn near shit myself. I pushed to port and rubbed the tree with the right side of the bow. We were at a good 14-knot clip, which is fast as hell for an almost fully loaded trawler. Then it shot down and disappeared about midship. I later learned that these are pretty uncommon in the Aleutians, where we were fishing. They're called deadheads and only 2 of the guys on the boat had seen them before. They float vertically, and bob straight up and down. These things were known to destroy older wood boats and kill crews. I'm just glad I wasn't dragging the net, and it would have cost us in the ballpark of $100K. I've seen what most people would consider worse, but the fear that a huge bobbing tree in the middle of Alaskan waters come out of effing nowhere tops my list. My brother used to work on cruise ships as a photographer. He worked on the QE2 a few times. On most cruises, he'd just do the round trip, but for the QE2 World Cruise, he'd do all the stops until Hong Kong, and the company would give him the cash for his flight home. Instead of taking the flight, he'd work on a ship coming back to the UK, giving him a bit of a bonus pay. So anyway, he got himself a job as a deckhand on a container ship heading from Hong Kong back to Southampton. The crew were Russian. They all got on well, of course, but his experiences with maritime environments meant he understood the difference between doing it right and doing it dangerously. These Russians had a habit of doing things dangerously. So only a few days from Hong Kong, one of the crew got really ill and needed to be taken to the nearest hospital. They were out of range of any heli evacuation, so radioed out to see if any nearby vessels were heading back towards Hong Kong. There was, and before long they were readying to tether to another ship to get them across via a winch. Well, Some of the deckhands weren't very well trained because one of the Russians positioned himself between the mooring line and the side of the ship. Due to the high seas, this shit was flicking about like a mofo. I remember my brother telling me he knew this dude was going to get F up right as it happened. The line got taut and snapped straight in a completely different direction, pinning his thighs to the side of the ship. As it continued its journey along the deck, snipped both his legs off like a knife through butter. My brother said it took less than 10 seconds for the light to leave his eyes. It was like someone had slaughtered a whale on the deck, there was so much blood. Ships are dangerous places, especially in high seas. One night on the 00204 watch in the Persian Gulf on a military transport, the whole sky went from pitch black of 2 o'clock to fully lit in a second. This went on for about 30 seconds, then back to pitch black. We called up the neighboring ships and HQ, no one knew what happened. Our best guess was a meteor. Second story was a couple years before the first, cruising around the Philippines and see nothing at all visual and on radar. All of a sudden we see a faint white light, about 100 yards off our port bow. Typically we don't let anything get within a mile of our ship. Grab the binos and head to the bridge wing, and there is just a little banker boat with his outboard motor and a flashlight. Even with radar, NVGs and an infrared camera we couldn't see this guy's little 20-foot boat in a 6-foot sea without lights on. Obviously more crazy stuff than creepy in my career so far. The people are the craziest thing you will experience at sea. Had one guy who wouldn't go outside the skin of the ship at night because the aliens would abduct him. Again. I used to hear a woman whisper my name at night. I hadn't slept in weeks because it scared me to death. Then an old man asked me if I was okay one morning. And he noticed I was exhausted and said, "You know, if you hear her too, it's okay. She's nice. She won't hurt you. She watches out for us." He was also parked in that marina but for years. I'll never forget the chills I felt. I talked to other boaters as well and they had heard her too. I finally saw her one night and she was a Taino Indian. She was beautiful. And faded away as I gasped. USN Sailor. I have seen a lot of remarkable things, but the creepiest was a great white shark that swam, more like drifted, in between the two ships during an underway replenishment off the coast of Australia. I could make an educated guess on how big it was, but just let me tell you it was way bigger than the biggest sharks I've seen on the Shark Week shows. Much longer and twice as massive as the biggest shark ever seen on the YouTube videos I've seen. It didn't move a single inch. It just floated, mouth open, in between as everyone on the bridge wing exclaimed, "Holy effing shit." Its teeth were as big as a man's head. And it had massive scars down its back and tail from a ship's propeller. I wouldn't have believed it if I didn't see it with my own eyes. I sailed on the American aircraft carrier, USS George Washington in 2000 and 2002. A couple of things I remember are pulling into Lisbon, Portugal for a port visit. Carriers can't pull pierside in Lisbon, so we had to take boats back and forth. I was looking down at the water and there was an 2-inch too, that didn't have a jellyfish in it. We were sailing through a giant bloom of them and all I could think of is if someone could survive if they fell in. The USS Cole was part of our battle group. We left her behind in the Red Sea while we went through the Suez Canal. Once we entered the Mediterranean Sea, the Admiral went on the 1MC ship speaker system, and told us that a rib boat had hit her and blown a hole in the side. About a month later we were pulling into Palma, Spain when a rib boat came barreling towards us. The security detail was called on deck and they were ready to blow them out of the water. The commanding officer quickly told them to not shoot. It turned out to be Greenpeace. For the next 5 hours Greenpeace and hundreds of their friends circled the ship in their boats and jet skis. Those guys probably had no idea how close they came to getting killed that day. Sailing across the Atlantic, especially in the winter, can get intense. Carriers have advanced stabilization capabilities because the flight deck needs to be safe for landing. Even with that, there are times where the ship bobbed around like a cork. Nothing too extensive like some of the stories here, but I worked as a tuna fisherman for a tiny bit, where I'd spend 3 to 4 weeks out at a time, taking around 3 days of 24-hour travel to get where me and one other person, the captain who was a 5th-generation fisherman, were fishing. So many stories of insane things that I could be here all night, but one was near the end of the season, and we pushed out farther than we should have, over 100 nautical miles, where we had no business being as a 37-foot trawler. And then we are caught in a bad storm. I had barely enough time to, very carefully, board up all of the windows before the boat started scooping when coming down one of the 12-feet waves. The first third of the boat dives underwater before popping back up, only to travel up another wave and do it again, and again, as waves got larger and things got worse. Basically, the captain and I stayed the cabin, bracing ourselves with each wave, staring at the radar in hopes we could stay in the position of taking the waves head-on and avoid being capsized. After a few minutes, and the fear that this 5th-generation fisherman was exuding, I just accepted that I was going to die there, and the experience of that acceptance, and the event itself, had a profound effect on my perception and the way I've lived life afterward. We eventually made it out, and didn't say a lot to each other afterward. Lots of stories from that time, but this was the creepiest, I'd say. Submarine sailor. Nothing creepy, but some of my best memories are sitting on top of the sail smoking a cigarette in the pitch black under the stars. Scary. We had an electrical fire in the engine room one time. Another time during a scram exercise we flooded the diesel. Scary. Edit, just remembered one of the worst memories. We were on patrol, underwater, for an extended period of time. I'm talking weeks and weeks and weeks without fresh air. We had completed our mission and were heading into port. I went up the sail to get in a smoke, almost immediately after we had it rigged. Climbing back down afterwards, the smell that filled my nostrils. 175 men who had limited their hygiene routine for many weeks. It was downright putrid. Since we were surfaced, we ventilated and only the 3 of us got to experience it. So I've worked in hospitality, including on a private yacht. This is in the Baltic. We were not near shore. It's very late. I assume everyone else had gone to sleep, but I was not very sleepy after a pretty stressed day. The top crew helming the ship on the night shift was at an Angel and so could not see me. I went on the deck and just looked at the ocean. Do you know that very strange feeling when you sense that somebody is looking at you? I could swear that there was something just below the surface moving in pace with us. I don't remember how much time passed. It felt like a long time. I was just staring just at the edge of my eyesight, thinking that I would see something. I guess it could have been fish or some sea mammal, but it felt wrong. I wish I had a more interesting conclusion than that. I actually don't even remember going back to my cabin that I shared with 2 other stews. The next morning I didn't talk about it, but then a few days later, I brought it up. No one thought much of it except one of the deckhands that had been working at sea for a long time. He said he had felt the same thing and seen the same thing several times, but only at night, and only when he was alone. I have no idea what to make of it. But I really feel in my heart it was not an animal. Former commercial fisherman. One morning we had a Russian submarine surface about a quarter mile off the stern with its periscope fully raised. We had a marine biologist from the state as an observer, and I'll never forget him saying, "Is that a goddamn submarine?" We were drinking coffee early in the morning when this happened, and the captain kinda just pretended it wasn't there. Didn't call it in on the radio or anything. In fact, we assumed it was an American sub as we were near a US Navy base. Coast Guard showed up and started trying to hail the sub via the radio, which the captain had left on an emergency channel to listen in. I'll never forget our faces as we hear, "Russian submarine Victor Lanif, please respond." Was on a 2-week cruise on a huge ship, and one morning there was a ton of commotion coming from one side of the ship. It looked like a woman had fallen off the ship and was in the water below, face down in a summer dress, her hair sprawling around her as she lay face down and completely motionless in the water, bobbing up and down as she was carried by the gentle waves of the ocean. You think you're tough until you see some shit like that. People were crying, taking their curious kids elsewhere, others were frantically trying to find staff to go rescue her. As it turns out, a woman had left her sundress and wig out to dry on her balcony the night before, and the wind that morning had blown it into the water. An announcement was made and everyone was so relieved, and there was a lot of laughter. It was surreal to see everyone going from such worried, sad expressions, some were outright bawling their eyes out, to completely in hysterics laughing and hugging one another. I think we were all reminded of how precious life was that day, and it really was a huge relief. It was terrible in the moments where we thought it was an actual person. What made it believable is that you're up so high on this ship it's hard to see details down below, because of the distance along with the waves and water obscuring finer details. My friends and I, who were on the cruise together, drank and laughed a lot that night. It was a very sobering event. Edit, your replies are making me doubt what I was told. I think I answered this a few years ago. While sailing in northern Alaska, during the Northern Lights, we saw what we thought was a bright spotlight from some aircraft at like 3 a.m. It shined for about 10 seconds, went away, and shined one more time, and didn't make any sound. It was high over some mountains, so we couldn't quite see what it was. Only 4 of the crew saw it. And we laughed that if we told anyone, not a single person would believe the way we would describe it. An unforgettable night for us. That was a good crew to sail with. I saw someone pick up their half-eaten Snickers bar off a deck riser next to the toilet in the head of combat systems berthing, and keep eating it. That head flooded with sitch tea, black water aka poop, at least once a week because the sounding and security watch would go to sleep, instead of responding to the tank full alarm, and pressing the button to pump it out. 2 things. First was the amount of stars you can see from the middle of the Atlantic. Had a girlfriend with me and we would talk while watching shooting stars. I swear some of them were just moving and not shooting, but who really knows? Gave me the sense that humans are really just egotistical ants in the universe. Second was when the ocean was smooth as glass. When I walked out the skin of ship, I silently gasped because I was really scared. The calmness of it all and the lack of distinction of the horizon was terrifying. I went back in the skin of the ship out of fear, then came back out about 10 minutes later and just breathed. The most terrifyingly amazing aspect of the calmness was seeing the details of the clouds in the ocean, then the occasional ripple. Felt like I had crossed dimensions into a heaven I was not supposed to see. Not creepy, but totally weird. 2 Chinese boats, like small, old, fishing vessels, meeting up in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean like half a mile behind us. This was so random, within international waters but so freaking far away from China. I still wonder what the hell they were doing there. They had no AIS. The first one to arrive close by, passed next to us as if to check who we were and if we were keeping course, sailing vessel, and then went straight towards the other ship and mated. Maybe drug trafficking or maybe just fishing. But yeah, still pretty far away from their most likely official harbor and kind of weird. It was literally in the middle of the pond, around 10 degrees north of the equator, so not your typical fishing route. Those are spies. When I was in the Navy, we'd get followed by the nastiest, rustiest, most rundown and covered in bird shit fishing boats you've ever seen. Until you look closer and notice all the antennae. A man swimming alone in the Java Sea. He had been floating for a couple of days, and although several boats had passed him, he didn't dare hail a ship not from Indonesia, because he feared being taken as a slave or something. It's possible he was a little mad, but he did seem happy to have us turn up. Back when I was a cadet at a merchant ship, I used to be exhausted and overworked all the time that I started hallucinating stuff at night. My watch used to start at 4 in the morning. One fine day we hit a storm and the wind was coming with such a force that it was creating a wailing sound like somebody is crying outside. I went to check outside and saw a shadowy figure sitting at the corner. I knew I was hallucinating, but still I shat my pants. Never went outside during a storm after that. I'm not a sailor at all. But I did a few boat trips with a friend who moved boats around for a living. He was usually carrying boats from the French Riviera, Monaco, Nice, Antibes, Cannes, to Corsica. My very first trip with him, we left from Monaco on our way to, I think, Calvi. We left in the evening, and the trip started very well, with dolphins following us around. Nice moment. Around 2 a.m., in the middle of a pitch-black night, very far from any coast, we saw a tiny light in the distance, pretty much on our way. And as we got closer, we saw it was a tiny fishing boat. The kind that usually doesn't go very far from the coast, except we were more than 100 kilometers from the coast. We slowed down as we got close to it, and yelled to check if someone was on it. No answer. So we decided to get close to it. And soon it became obvious it was empty. There were just a few bottles of water, some snacks, some fishing gear, even some dead fish in a bucket, and an old Nokia phone, still on. But nobody on. My friend called on the radio, explaining the situation. Italian Coast Guards told us to wait around till they arrived. We did, and when they arrived they told us they would investigate the situation. They took our ID, wrote down our explanation of the situation, and let us leave to finish our trip. The whole thing was creepy to me, as it seemed obvious the owner had fallen from his boat, couldn't get back in, and drowned. I had this in mind for weeks, thinking we could maybe have rescued the guy if we had passed there slightly earlier. After a while, this story faded in my mind, and I went on with my life. Till someday my friend called me to explain that he got a call from an Italian guy, who thanked him because he could get his boat back thanks to us. He was the owner of the tiny boat, who explained he was out fishing not too far from the shore, when he had a big chest pain. He made an emergency call and was soon rescued, but his boat was left to drift. Till we found it. Learning that the guy was still alive, erased the creepy side of this story from my head, and I was happy about it. This happened to my cousin's ex-wife about a few months ago. This was in Ecuador. She is some sort of researcher or scientist of that nature. I believe the company she worked for chartered a captain and a boat to go somewhere off the coast. So the boat starts sinking. How? She manages to get a signal on her phone and was able to call and text my cousin about the situation that was unfolding, and she lost signal again. My cousin managed to contact the authorities and the Coast Guard and the search began. 8 to 10 hours had gone by and luckily they found them. When the Coast Guard found them, what they found was that my cousin's ex-wife had absorbed so much water that her face and body started being very puffy, and completely sunburned. If it not have been for the life jackets and plastic gasoline containers that they managed to hold on to, because it floated they would have sank and drowned. Years ago my friends and I visited Thailand, and went on several excursions on a boat with a captain. On one of the evenings we were out at night and it was pitch black except for the green lights that were coming from the large commercial fishing boats way out in the distance. We had stopped for a while to take in the view and eat, when it started to rain. The captain thought it was best to head back, and then quickly realized that the boat propeller wasn't working and something was caught on it. He grabbed his head-mounted flashlight and a knife, and jumped in the water. He was gone for a good minute, which felt like eternity as we were huddled around trying to figure out what was happening. Fear started kicking in as we waited. Then he suddenly re-emerged panting and told us that shortly after he jumped in, he lost his flashlight and had to literally feel his way underwater towards the propeller, reaching and cutting a plastic tarp that had wound itself around the propeller, cut it loose, and made his way back to the surface in the dark. It was a strange set of emotions as we were completely impressed with the badass display we just witnessed, relieved he made it back but also freaked out imagining what would have happened if he hadn't.